Hello everybody. Today we're going to be learning about just the basics of genetics. This is section 11-1 of your textbook, and you should have a fill-in note sheet to help you get all this information down. This should be a review from 8th grade, so hopefully as we go through this you'll remember most of these things from middle school. First things first, the book never tells us this, but there's actually two types of traits, and we have to know what both types are. There are inherited traits. Inherited traits are passed on from your parents to you. The reason why we have these inherited traits is because we get genes from mom and dad, and those genes control our inherited traits. This is what we're going to be studying, is exactly what are the rules for this, how do we get these traits from mom and dad, and exactly how do they control our physical part of those traits. That's called the phenotype. Another trait that we have are called acquired traits. These are traits that just occur during your lifetime. These are not controlled by genes. Good examples are like dyeing hair, scars. These are not something we're going to study. There's really nothing to study. If someone dyes their hair, gets a tattoo, or something like that, that just happens to them. It has nothing to do with their DNA. If someone has purple hair, their kids are not going to have purple hair because that's an acquired trait. It has nothing to do with the DNA, has nothing to do with egg and sperm. So we're only going to focus on inherited traits when we talk about genetics. Okay, inherited traits are controlled by genes. All humans contain the same genes. And what I mean by that is all humans have a gene for hair color. All humans have a gene for the texture of their hair. All humans have a gene for blood type. All humans have genes for how tall they're going to be. So we all have the same genes because we're human. And those genes work in a certain way to give all the characteristics that make us human. But we're not all exactly the same. So here's some examples of the same kinds of genes that you and me and everybody in the room and every human all has. We all have genes for all of these things. But we're not all identical. So that must mean that there's different kinds of hair color genes, and different kinds of blood type genes, and different types of skin color and eye color and bone structure and everything else. There's different kinds of every sort of gene. Those different types of genes are called alleles. So what makes you a unique human is that you have a very unique combination of alleles. A combination of alleles that's never been seen before. If you're an identical twin, you have the same exact alleles as your twin, but you've had different experiences, so you have different different acquired traits from your twin. So every single person has the same exact genes, but we have different versions of those genes. Those different versions of the genes are called alleles, and that's what makes you unique, and that's what makes you different from the people sitting next to you right now. So who came up with all of this? Who was the person who's credited for discovering this? This is the scientist you need to know. I haven't had you know too many scientists yet this year, but Gregor Mendel is a scientist that you need to know. Let me tell you a little bit about Gregor Mendel. He's considered the father of genetics. Before Mendel, people thought that everything blended. They thought if your dad was 6 foot tall and your mom was 5 foot tall, that you would be 5'6". So they thought everything would kind of meet in the middle. Obviously, it didn't work that way. So what they assumed was if you were not a perfect blending of both parents, they would say there was some defect with the genetic material. So they would just kind of insult you because they were wrong and they didn't really want to discover how things really worked. But Mendel changed all that. So again, the blending theory is incorrect, and it says that every trait from your dad blends with every trait from your mom to make you a perfect mixture of mom and dad. Well, Mendel refuted this. Even though he was probably taught the blending theory, he did a lot of work with pea plants. I'm sure you remember that from 8th grade. He was a monk in Austria. He was a teacher in the monastery. He lived in the 1800s, and he did some work that really disproved this blending theory of inheritance. So he studied how traits were inherited in pea plants. Inheritance means passed on. Okay, how did traits go from the mom and the dad plant to the offspring plant? He wanted to know how they were transmitted, and that's called inheritance. Okay, why do you think he studied peas? Well, I mean, peas are a lot easier to study than elephants. Okay, peas are cheap. They're very easy to take care of. You can store a lot of them in a small space. So it's a lot easier to study something like a plant than it is an animal, and that's why he studied plants. What he did was, he used purebred plants. Purebred plants means that if you had a purebred tall pea plant, that for at least 10 generations, that plant, those plants were nothing but tall. Okay, you've heard the word purebred before, part with dogs. A purebred dog is a lot more expensive than a mixed breed dog. And the reason why is you have to control dogs to make them purebred. You have to make sure that if you want a purebred German Shepherd, that only German Shepherds mate together. So that takes a little bit more work because dogs don't care. They'll mate with any other dog usually, but to keep them purebred, it takes a little bit more work. And so Mendel made sure that he was working with purebred plants just to make sure that there was no variables that were going to really get in it and kind of mess up his work. All right, so here's Mendel's first, what we call genetic cross. A genetic cross means a mating. So if you look on the part before the arrow on the left, he has a purebred tall plant. So that means all the generations of this plant have always been tall. And he mates it with a purebred short plant, which means all the generations in this plant's family were short. Now, how do you mate plants? He took a paintbrush or a feather, he took pollen from one plant, and he put it onto a flower of the other plant, and then the flower would go away and it would make a pea pod. He would then take the seeds and plant those. Okay, the seeds, you guys know, are the baby plants. He planted them, gave them water, gave them sunlight, and then he let them grow to be adults, and all he looked at was the height. That's all he was studying was height. So what he saw was when you cross a purebred tall one with a purebred short one, all he got was all tall ones, which was weird because the blending theory would say he should get all medium ones. But that's not what he got. So he did something else. And the next thing he did was he took those two plants to the right, the tall with the big T little t and the tall with the big T little t, and he crossed those together because he just wanted to see, well, what happened to that shortness? Did it still exist inside those plants somehow? And if you take a look at this is exactly what he got. He took those two offspring from that first genetic cross, the two tall ones. Remember, they had one parent that was tall and one parent that was short. And he crossed them, took the peas, planted all the peas. Now, he had more than 4. But what he found was he got 3 tall ones for every short one. Now, this was really strange because there was no medium ones, first off. So the blending theory was completely wrong. But the second thing is that shortness factor, that shortness characteristic disappeared in the plants to the left, even though they had a short parent. But then it reappeared in the grandkids. And if you looked at the picture to the right, that's what happened. He had 3 tall ones for every 1 short one, which was strange. He did not expect for that to happen. So here's the results. He took 2 of those offspring plants from that original cross. Remember, offspring just means kids. They were called hybrids because they weren't purebred anymore. It was a purebred tall with a purebred short, so all their offspring are called hybrids because they weren't purebred anymore. And then we see this 3 tall to 1 short ratio. So if he had 100 plants, 75 came out tall, 25 came out short. And here's the entire picture. All the way to the left, we start with the parents. They were purebreds. They made hybrid offspring right in the middle there, but they were tall. And then the grandkids, we had the 3 tall to every 1 short. This allowed Mendel to come up with his first law. His first law is called the law of dominance. And what he said was that tall factor was dominant. It would dominate that short factor. So he said the law of dominance means that certain alleles, or he called them factors, what they really are is pieces of DNA. Certain pieces of DNA that you get from mom and dad can be dominant, while others can be recessive. Recessive just means able to be dominated. They get covered up if there's a dominant one there. So if you have a tall allele in pea plants and a short allele, the tall allele is going to be dominant and the short one's going to be recessive. And all you'll see is a tall plant because the dominant covers up the short one. Again, it's disproved the blending theory. And here's a couple definitions that you need. A dominant allele is an allele whose trait shows up in the offspring whenever that allele is present, and we represent that with a capital letter. A recessive allele is an allele whose trait is masked or covered up when a dominant allele is present. So for a trait, you always get two alleles. You get one from mom and one from dad. If you get two dominant alleles, a dominant from mom and a dominant from dad, like big T, then you'll have the dominant characteristic. In pea plants, that's tall. If you get two recessive alleles, a little t from mom and a little t from dad, then that characteristic will be a short height, because that's all you have, just DNA on how to be short. If you get one of each, that's called being heterozygous. And then again, the dominant one is what the characteristic would be. So if you got a big T and a little t, you wouldn't know you had that little t because it would be a tall plant, just as tall as the original big T parent. Now let me give you a couple more vocab words just so you can understand where we're going here. First of all, a genotype is a combination of two alleles. Now why is it two? We get one from dad via a sperm cell. Plants have sperm cells too, that's what's inside of pollen. And one allele came from the mom through the egg cell. So for every single trait, you have a genotype. The genotype is the two pieces of DNA, the one you got from mom and the one you got from dad. We represent these with letters. For dominant alleles, we always use a capital letter, and for recessive alleles, we always use a lowercase letter. So a genotype is the type of genes you have. You get two alleles for every genotype, one from mom, one from dad. The phenotype is the physical manifestation of that trait. Right? So to find out someone's phenotype, you just look at them. You want to know your phenotype for eye color? Just look and see what color your eyes are. Phenotype for hair color? See what color your hair is. You want to know the phenotype for your own height? Just measure how tall you are. So phenotype is the physical characteristic. Okay, you want to know your phenotype for blood type? The doctor can do a test and tell you have AB blood or O blood or whatever it is. Okay? But the genotype, that's the two genes you have that control that phenotype. Okay, so remember, genotype means the type of genes, kind of. Alright? And you have two of those, an allele from mom and an allele from dad. So a genotype is the combination of two alleles. If they're dominants or recessives or whatever, then that's what makes your phenotype. And that's the physical part for that one trait you're talking about. Now, genotypes, there's three types. Genotypes can be homozygous. Homo means the same. So as soon as you see that prefix homo, you're either going to have two capital letters or two lowercase letters. If you have two capital letters, that means mom gave you a dominant allele and dad gave a dominant allele, so it's homozygous dominant. So there's two capital letters. And we're going to see how to use these in just a minute. Genotypes can also be homozygous recessive. That means mom gave a lowercase letter, or a lowercase or a recessive allele, and dad gave the same thing. So now that offspring is homo, which means the same, homozygous recessive for that trait. Genotypes can also be heterozygous. Hetero means two different things together. So heterozygous would be one of the parents gave a dominant allele, that'd be the capital T, and one gave a recessive allele, that'd be the lowercase t. Okay? Now in the next presentation, I'm going to show you and remind you from 8th grade, how do we use these letters to predict the offspring of a cross? Okay, how do we do Punnett squares? And that's going to be your homework for the weekend, is to practice some Punnett squares and see if you remember this and see if you're able to do this from middle school.